Well, hello, and thanks for taking the time to join us on another of our NWBA midweek reflections, which I hope help to keep you going on your discipleship journey. And yes, you are allowed to watch them at weekends as well. It's just that we tend to make them during the week. And in this one, I'm going to invite you to spend a few minutes inside one of the stories from the Gospels. And we find it in Mark chapter 12, verse 41. And we're going to read through to verse 2 of chapter 13, and this is what it says. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few pence. And calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." And as Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." "Do you see all these great buildings?" replied Jesus. "Not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." There are times when I've heard people say that the words of Scripture might be the inspiration of God, but the chapter and verse divisions certainly aren't. Well, this might be one of those instances when comments like that just might be justified, because the division made between chapters 12 and 13, I think very often make us see these two conversations that are recorded one after the other as something separate from each other. So let me share with you why I want us to try and bring these two episodes back together. Many of us at the moment have probably got a little bit more time on our hands than we're used to. And that might well mean that we're spending a little bit more time dwelling on issues and messages that we pick up, turning around in our heads the things that concern us, or maybe we've just got more time to spend looking at stuff on the internet, reading things, listening to things. And of course, an awful lot of the messages that are circulating at the moment are quite worrying messages. And all of these things will be having their impact on us. So what are you listening to? What are you looking at? What are you taking notice of? And I ask these questions because it seems to me that these are the questions that emerge from these few verses in Mark's Gospel. If you stop and think about it for a moment, these two consecutive conversations are something of a mirror image of each other. Jesus calls over his disciples and he says, "Hey, look at this." And then one of the disciples does the same to Jesus. They want him to take notice of something too, the magnificent stones that make up the new temple. Both of these things are in the picture. The woman giving her offering and the great big stones that cause a backdrop to it. Both of those things are there to see. But each of those things tells a very different story. You see, what was going on at the time is that King Herod was very busy trying to make a name for himself. And he knew that the great kings of old, like David and Solomon, were remembered as builders of a great temple. So he wanted to be known as a temple builder. And like all ambitious seekers of power and prestige, he wanted his temple to be bigger and better than any other in history. And that's what was happening. But the simple truth is that Herod was anything but a great king. In fact, the only reason he was king at all was because the Roman emperor who really ran the show allowed him to be king. Even then, the Middle East could be quite a volatile place, and the Romans had very quickly worked out that first century Palestine and Israel was a much easier place to run if the people thought that one of their own was fronting the whole regime. So it suited them for Herod to be king, and it suited them for Herod to build a great temple. Because if you've seen that famous "What have the Romans ever done for us" sketch, well, maybe the people who put that together were a little bit more on the mark than perhaps we recognise. Because that's exactly how the Romans operated. We might have you held in servitude, we might have robbed you of all your rights, we might have taxed you into poverty, but if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have this great temple to boast about. And that temple was certainly doing the trick, because along come a bunch of visiting pilgrims in the guise of Jesus' disciples, and they buy it hook, line and sinker. Look, isn't it brilliant? This is what we might describe as the wow factor moment in the visit after Passover. Look, teacher, it looks fantastic. And Jesus doesn't disagree with them. He just sees beyond it. He says, and he knows, that within 40 years or so, the facade will be lifted. The people will get fed up with the Romans, and the Romans will get fed up with their puppet kings, and just their armies will just march in and destroy the lot. Jesus says it's going to happen, and history proved that it did. So at one level, this is a pretty hopeless and distressing story. But that all depends on what you choose to look at. Because Jesus isn't interested in the great stones and the pillars and the balustrades of their great new temple, but he is interested in a lonely widow who quietly makes her way to the collecting box. And sure, there were the rich benefactors pouring in their big offerings in front of everyone, so everyone could be impressed with how rich they were. These were the people who, if they gave enough money, might get their name on a stone in the courtyard, or who could go down in history as having been a great part of this great scheme. And compared to them, she gave nothing. But frankly, there was no point in giving anything. Because as Jesus points out, and history goes on to prove, within a few decades, the whole thing is going to be rubble anyway. So whether you gave £1,000,000 or a few pence, it made no difference. What they gave was irrelevant. But the spirit in which they gave it was everything. And what Jesus saw was not what this woman gave, but the spirit in which she gave it. He saw generosity. He saw sacrifice. He saw the devotion that lay behind it. And for Jesus, the wow factor moment that day wasn't the magnificent stones. It was this great act of faith and devotion. And that kind of reminds me about another debate about temples that's recorded in John's Gospel. On that occasion, Jesus is having a discussion with a woman from Samaria, and she brought the conversation round to the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim, and asked him the question, which is the right one? Which is the one we should worship God in? That's what she asked him. And Jesus just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, well, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you worship in spirit and truth. And that widow, that afternoon in the temple courts of Jerusalem, as it happened, gave her offering and made her worship in an attitude of spirit and truth. So what does all of that have to say to us? Well, quite a few things, I think. First of all, there are some big stories around at the moment. Big statistics, big questions, big concerns, and those things will all too easily capture our attention, just like those stones captured the attention of the disciples. And I'm not saying that we should just ignore those things. After all, Jesus didn't ignore what was in front of him. He just saw deeper realities behind them. So I guess the questions for us at the moment is, what is God saying through these big stories? And what truths might we see through them? But also, what else might God be pointing our attention to? So that's certainly one thing that we can learn. And something else is that I never find myself able to talk about this story without mentioning that this woman came and went, and at least according to Mark's version of events, never had a clue that Jesus noticed her and drew the attention of his followers to her. Just imagine that. She might well have gone to her grave never knowing that her story was going to be immortalized for all time. So if you're feeling isolated or lonely or forgotten, or maybe just taken for granted and unnoticed, well, God doesn't take you for granted. God doesn't fail to notice. And if you feel that compared to everything else that's going on, what you've got to offer is just insignificant and of no use, well, that's not important. It's the spirit in which you do things. It's the person you are that matters. And that's sort of takes us to the other thing that we might learn from this. Because it seems to me that at the heart of this episode is one simple question. What really matters? And that's a question that we're finding ourselves asking an awful lot, and in an awful lot of ways at the moment. And it strikes me that as we look to the future, there are two big questions that are beginning to emerge. One is when is everything going to get back to normal? When can we carry on as we were, almost as if this had never happened? Now, to me, that's not an unreasonable question, but it's very much a question that comes from ourselves. And in all honesty, no one really knows the answer. But I'm not at all sure that that's the question that God's asking. But I do believe that God constantly asks us and constantly tries to show us what really matters. What is God trying to say? What are we learning about what really matters? Not just through this crisis, but in everything that we do and experience. So I want to invite you to go make yourself a cup of tea or coffee, sit down somewhere quietly for half an hour or so, and just ponder this story and some of the questions that it raises. Questions like, what am I listening to? What am I noticing at the moment? And what impact are those things having on me? What am I not noticing? And more to the point, what is God noticing? And what might God be wanting to draw my attention to today, tomorrow, this week? What is God saying to me? Am I listening to the right voices and the right narratives? And what is God noticing in me? Even if I feel very alone and isolated at the moment, what comfort and strength can I draw from knowing that God takes notice, even if I don't always realise that he has? And to sum it all up, what really matters? What really matters to God? What really matters to me? And are they the same things? And I know that we can't get together at the moment, so maybe you could get in touch with someone, a friend, someone that you perhaps talk to about these kind of things reasonably regularly. Maybe someone who's in your home group or some other group that you're part of at your church, and ask them to read this scripture, to watch this reflection, then spend some time pondering those questions too. And then maybe just give each other a call and share what you've heard God saying through that. So I hope these thoughts and ideas are of some help. And thanks for listening, and may God bless you.